Okay, let's dive right in. We're breaking down a huge Supreme Court decision that is seriously shaking up U.S. trade policy. We're going to look at the ruling, the massive economic fallout, and what it all means for the administration's America First agenda.
This quote from President Trump, it really tells you everything you need to know about the administration's economic strategy. It's a philosophy that would ultimately pave the way for a pretty dramatic constitutional showdown.
So on February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court drops what you can only call a bombshell. It was a ruling that totally upended the core of the administration's trade plans and drew a very firm line in the sand about presidential power.
And it was a decisive 6-3 vote. The court essentially said the president couldn't use this specific law, the IEEPA, to just impose massive tariffs on his own. And look, this wasn't just some technical ruling about trade policy. No, this was way bigger. This was a fundamental statement on the very limits of presidential power.
So you're probably wondering, how did this whole thing even get to the Supreme Court? Well, to really get to the heart of the conflict, we've got to rewind the clock to a law passed back in 1977.
Okay, so here's the law at the center of it all, the IEEPA. The administration used this act to justify its tariffs. Their argument was basically, hey, we have these national emergencies, like trade deficits and the fentanyl crisis. So this law gives us the green light to regulate trade as we see fit.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because you have this classic constitutional clash. On one hand, the White House says IEEPA gives them broad power to regulate imports. But on the other hand, businesses were saying, hold on, a tariff is a tax. And the Constitution is crystal clear that only Congress gets to levy taxes. So the big question for the court was, which one wins out? And the answer came down to this thing called the Major Questions Doctrine. Now, it sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. The court basically said, look, if Congress was going to hand over a power this massive, the power to essentially tax trillions of dollars in goods, they would have spelled it out in giant flashing letters in the law. And since they didn't, that power stays with Congress. It's a huge deal. So, while the legal arguments are fascinating, the real-world financial fallout from all this, well, it's been absolutely staggering. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars.
Just let this number sink in for a second. $195 billion. That's how much the U.S. Treasury collected from these tariffs in just a single year. That's a huge pile of cash that was impacting businesses and, regular consumers all across the country.
But here's the flip side. Since the court ruled the tariffs were unlawful, the government is now on the hook to pay a huge chunk of that back. We're talking an estimated $129 billion in refunds to American importers. One of the justices, in his dissent, even warned that sorting this all out would be a logistical mess. And you can see why.
And this wasn't just some abstract problem for Wall Street, You had huge companies like Costco suing to get their money back. But that uncertainty also trickled down, threatening jobs in retail and transportation, and it forced businesses everywhere to completely rethink their supply chains.
So, with the Supreme Court basically taking away the administration's main tool for these tariffs, the big question is, what happens now?
Right. Does this mean the trade war is just over? Did the Supreme Court put a stop to the whole America First trade policy with just one ruling?
Not even close. The White House has made it very clear this is a tactical setback, not a strategic retreat. The battlefield has just changed.
The administration is already pivoting. They're turning to other legal tools they have in their back pocket. You've got Section 232, which allows for tariffs based on national security, think steel and aluminum. Then there's Section 301, which is a powerful tool to go after unfair trade practices. The bottom line is, even without IEEPA, the president still has a lot of tools left in the toolbox.
This whole saga, from the initial announcement to the Supreme Court's rebuke, it really leaves us in a period of major uncertainty for the future of American and global trade. It's a very unsettled landscape. And this timeline really lays out the whole whirlwind journey, doesn't it? It all kicked off in 2025 with those bold tariffs. Then the lower courts started pushing back, all leading to that historic Supreme Court decision. But as you can see, the story doesn't end there. It just turns the page to a new chapter.
So, in the end, the Supreme Court definitely put a check on executive power, reasserting Congress's authority over trade. But the administration's broader fight over trade policy, that is far from over. It leaves us with a critical, unsettling question for the future of the U.S. economy. Who will ultimately win the war over trade?